Are the Browns leaning into tanking for a better pick? I'll answer that and more in the latest episode of the Locked On Browns podcast.
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Dog Pound? I'm Spencer German, your host of the Locked On Browns podcast, and proudly covering your Cleveland Browns each and every single day in the land and on the road. The Browns aren't losing on purpose, but they're not necessarily trying to win either. A former quarterback that Browns fans just can't quit, but they probably should. And so long to Mike Vrabel. His departure paves the way for several other offseason moves within the coaching staff. As always, I want to thank you for being an everydayer, making the Locked On Browns podcast your first listen every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Without further ado, let's get into it. And I understand that the Browns at this point, many fans, maybe yourself included, are all in on this idea of Cleveland trying to get the best possible draft pick. And obviously, there was a lot that came with that this weekend, a lot of good positives that came with that this weekend, because nobody envisioned the Giants pulling off the win that they did over the Indianapolis Colts to help the Browns get an even higher pick. You knew Jacksonville and Tennessee was going to be a game that impacted where the Browns fell. And in the end, they get the number 3 pick through 17 weeks of the season. And so long as they lose on Saturday against the Baltimore Ravens, they are guaranteed a top 3 pick in the draft. So that's the good news if you're somebody who's kind of rooting actively for the Browns to tank their season and, not actively try to win. And I think that there's an important distinction here, though, between like a team actively tanking and maybe, not doing the most to win. Because here's my stance on this. Like, I don't think any team in this league actively goes about like tanking or tries to make that a thing where they're out there, telling players to do certain things or like purposely calling plays that are going to lead to them losing. I want to make that clear off the bat, because like telling your players, hey, lose this game, or calling plays that are going to cost you a game, like that stuff's not going to fly in a locker room. These players are professionals. They're putting their bodies in the line every single week. Like, they don't want to do that in for nothing. They don't want to go out there and take a beating in the name of just like for the franchise trying to get a better draft position in the upcoming draft. So like, that's not something. And if they catch on to a team doing that, it doesn't go over well in the locker room in terms of the players respecting a coach or a coaching staff. So it's not something that I really think is viable. It's not something that I think teams actually try to do with their teams. But I will say this, like in the case of the Browns, I do think that they took a look at where they were a few weeks back, probably after that Chiefs game. And, Jameis had the bad start, but he clearly had shown throughout the season that he can be a competent quarterback. He can make you competitive. He can keep you in games and give you the best chance to win of the quarterbacks that you had left. Maybe he was the guy that could give you the best chance to win from the start of the season if they had started the season with him. And obviously they didn't do that. They rode with Deshaun and they said that he gave you the best chance to win. And we saw how that worked out. But I digress on that because I do think like they understood, yes, okay, Jameis is a quarterback that is going to still keep us competitive. And they knew they had 3 games left in the schedule. And they decided to switch to DTR because he doesn't necessarily give them the best. He doesn't necessarily give them the best chance to win. So there's the difference there, though. It's not them actively saying like, hey, let's try to throw these games and lose on purpose so that we can get a better draft pick. It's more so just like not doing anything extra to help yourself try in the name of winning, I guess, like putting yourself in a position. Here's the best way I can put it. They are trying to control what they can control. What they can control is who they put out there at quarterback and which quarterback they believe isn't necessarily going to I've said it for several weeks now. I believe they understood who they had in DTR before this experiment here at the end of the season. I don't think they needed these last 2 games or maybe these last 3 games to figure that out. So I think they kind of looked at it and said, hey, we could put DTR out there. Guy who's a project, guy who we understand like isn't a starting caliber quarterback in this league most likely. And we can sell it as like, well, Jameis just turned the ball over too much. And it worked out perfectly where Jameis played so poorly in that Chiefs game that they sort of it was an easy sell to the locker room of like, well, hey, this just isn't cutting it. 2 weeks in a row, turnovers cost us in games against the Steelers and games against the Chiefs. We really need to sort of change things up and see if we can do something differently here. So let's put DTR out there, see what happens, and see if that helps us win it all. And you can at least sell that to a locker room. Like with the 3 games to go, that you can, it makes some sense to be like, we're trying to find a spark, right? Like the last time you had to make a quarterback change was because of the Deshaun Watson injury. You went to Jameis. It gave the team the spark that allowed them to beat the Ravens that following week. So I think it was an easier sell because the cards kind of fell in a nice way for you, where it's not like Jameis balled out against the Chiefs and then you're like, well, we actually got to make a quarterback change. Like, no, it played out perfectly. And it allowed them to kind of take a look and keep an eye on where they were and where they could finish in terms of the draft order and say, all right, let's not go overboard here. Let's put DTR out there and see what he kind of brings to the table. So is that, I guess, actively leaning into the tank? I guess technically. But again, it's not that I think that they're scheming things up or game planning week to week to go out and lose. And there's always the unknown. That's the hardest thing with this. Like, and it's why I don't believe that teams actually try to tank, because again, you're never going to be able to sell players on doing that. We saw that with the Giants this weekend. I mean, for the Giants, Darius Slayton of the Giants, who basically went out and was saying like, forget the tank. Like, sorry fans, we don't care. Like, and I think that sort of is the attitude that a lot of these players take, where it's like, yeah, listen, I'm not here to, please you in terms of where we land in the draft. I'm here to win football games. And so I don't know. I'm not going to call it like actively tanking and like, again, trying to like lose games in a way that is clear and obvious of what you're trying to do. But I just think they were sort of giving themselves the best opportunity not to win, if that makes sense. And so I guess, yeah, is that leaning into the tank? Maybe. But that's kind of my read on it. And I do wonder what that means for the starting quarterback position in Week 18, because I think Dorian Thompson-Robinson still fits that if that's your goal, he fits that to a T, he fits that perfectly. But at the same time, do you now, because you sold the locker room on like a quarterback change a couple weeks ago because the play wasn't good enough, do you now sell them on another one and pivot to somebody like Bailey Zappi to see what he can do, as we kind of talked about in the post-game show last week? Or sorry, on Monday or Sunday night into Monday. With that said, speaking of the quarterback position, there is a Browns quarterback that, while the Browns continue searching for their quarterback, is I guess what I meant to say, it is time to move on from a former quarterback here from Cleveland. I'll talk about it next on the Locked On Browns podcast. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions that you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? That definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions that I didn't even realize I was still paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so that you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even your long-term goals that you want to hit in a year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all the app's premium features. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/lockedon. All right, so it's time to get real with you, because there is a legit conversation that needs to be had about a former Browns quarterback. I understand that there is a contingent of Browns fans that are still infatuated with and holding out hope or clinging to this vision of Baker Mayfield and this player that obviously is playing at a pretty high level for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, has them on the brink of maybe winning that division and getting back to the playoffs for a second consecutive season. Got the payday this past offseason and is living up to being a good quarterback in this league. Maybe not a great quarterback, but a good quarterback in this league. And I understand why he was here. He was your first round pick. He was the guy, and he took this city by storm. Everybody seemed to there was this love affair with him as the franchise saving quarterback that everyone thought he was going to be. And obviously he's playing football at a pretty high level somewhere else, which, yes, it is a bad look for the organization that the QB they moved on from is playing really good football. And your QB situation is as volatile and unpredictable and just bad as ever. But I think that there's some important perspective here to keep in mind. And I honestly kind of, I don't want to say I hate, but I don't generally want to like dedicate a segment to talking about a former player who's no longer here and like the I guess contingent of fans who are just like holding on to it and refuse to let it go. Because I think that just kind of like feeds this machine that exists out there among Browns fans who are, just trying to one up each other and say like, see, I told you I was right about Baker. And I don't necessarily think that really accomplishes anything. Because this fan base, like you should want to be one like that. Browns fans have always been unified around their fandom. I hate, I don't want to be the reason that we're driving a wedge between anybody because we're talking about this, but I think it needs to be said because in a weekend where he played a phenomenal game and everyone's talking about like, well, he had more touchdown passes than any of the Browns quarterbacks have the last X amount of weeks or whatever. I get it. I understand why it's a bad look, and it's going to be a bad look forever because the Browns decided to move on from him, and the guy that they got in Deshaun Watson just can't play football anymore. At least that's what it seems. And so, yeah, they're going to have to lie in that bed. It's draped in this idea that the Browns made probably, maybe not even probably at this point. It is the worst trade in NFL history, hands down. Everyone's going to continue to remember it that way. And so they'll always look back and they'll say, well, you could have kept this guy and see what could have happened. And you got RG3 going down like the revisionist history of it all. And he's talking about why the Browns messed up by moving on from Baker Mayfield. I get where all it comes from. There's always going to be people ready to take victory laps on this stuff. But I think what's important to remember here, at the time that they moved on from Baker Mayfield, it wasn't just about finding a quarterback that they thought could be better than Baker. And I want to be clear, like I've never, ever faulted the Haslams, faulted this organization for trying to upgrade the quarterback position. I think Baker was fun. I think he was great in certain respects. I think Kevin Stefanski proved that he can get a lot out of Baker Mayfield in that 2020 season. And I would have liked to see how they could continue to function together if it had worked out that way. But I also understood like you could get better. You could upgrade. And so they tried to skip the line. They tried to sort of cheat the system here by not drafting one, but trading for one. And now they're paying the price for it. And they have to kind of wear the egg on their face because it didn't work out. But I don't blame them for trying to do that. That's the big point I always go back to. Now, the reason it didn't work out with Baker, though, is deeper than just like wanting to upgrade the quarterback position. I think that's the thing that people need to keep in mind here, because I understand it seems as simple as like one for one, you got rid of one quarterback and you added another. But what you didn't know, or maybe what you didn't realize, is what was going on behind the scenes. And behind the scenes, there was not a very good relationship between the team and Baker. It had run its course. There was problems in the locker room in terms of how he was viewed by his teammates, how his teammates kind of felt about him. I can tell you, like, him and Myles Garrett butted heads a little bit, and you, without having like a true franchise quarterback in your building at that point, because I think that there were still some questions about Baker. Myles Garrett was your franchise player and remains your franchise player. So on some level, like, what he says carries weight. It's why he said what he said a little over, I guess, a week and a half ago, where he's out here telling everybody, yeah, listen, I can see myself playing somewhere else if we're not trying to win right now. That's where I'm at in my career. It's what I want to see happen. So if we're not prioritizing that, then it might be time for me to go. Like, his words carry weight. And I think in that situation, his voice kind of won out over Baker Mayfield's. And, on top of the fact that, like, within that locker room, Myles Garrett's voice carried a little bit more weight than even probably Baker Mayfield's did, and there was a divide there. And those quotes about, I think it was Chris Mortensen who had them, where it was like, rest in peace, by the way. But yeah, like he had the quotes about like the Browns want an adult in the room. They felt like from an organizational standpoint that he was just too immature. And these are real things. They can be verified. There's sources who have shared the same stories and, talked about this before. They just felt Baker wasn't ready to be the face of the franchise quarterback. And so even if, and listen, I think that immaturity showed, by the way, in the way that he handled the trade for Deshaun's situation. Because I remember, like, leading up to this season, Wyatt Teller was on Ty Dunn, who does his own website, Going Long with Ty Dunn. He was on his podcast, and he flat out said that he, thinks that if Baker would have handled that differently, that he still could have been the starting quarterback for the Cleveland Browns, like today, like in 2024. And I do think there's probably some truth to that, but I think it spoke to his immaturity that, like, as soon as there was these rumors about the Browns inquiring about Deshaun Watson, he goes and puts out the Notes app thing and said the Notes app, statement of, I want to be traded. I've appreciated Cleveland, blah, 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 blah. Like, and that speaks to his immaturity. Like, he could have handled that in house. Maybe they could have smoothed things over. Maybe he could have come back. And I've been told that was the plan, was to bring him back with Deshaun and kind of have them there together, and they could kind of feed off of each other. One could kind of learn from one another, whatever. And that was supposed to kind of be the way they were going to move forward with it. But once Baker sort of, pulled the pin and threw the grenade, they knew that it was an untenable relationship completely. Like, at that point, it was completely unsalvageable. And so they had to move on top of the fact that they were already thinking about doing that anyway. So I just want people to keep that in mind, because I understand that, yes, it's a bad look when the quarterback you traded is by all accounts thriving in their own system in their post, playing for you career. And the situation that you stepped into has been a colossal disaster. We know that about this Browns team right now. But at the same time, it was just never going to work. I truly believe, I shouldn't say it was never going to work, because if he had handled that trade situation differently, I think it could have still worked out, and maybe he'd still be the quarterback here today in Cleveland. But at the moment, like, they needed a split. The relationship wasn't there. Baker was too immature. They felt that way about him. He was obviously over the organization once they went and made the trade for Deshaun, or were at least inquiring about Deshaun. And so there was no coming back from it at that point. And Baker's even talked about this. Like, if you go back and listen to some of his recent interviews in recent years, he has talked about how, like, he needed the trade from Cleveland to Carolina sort of humbled him. And it allowed him then to end up in a place in Tampa where he's very comfortable with his life and he's very comfortable with his situation. He's playing really good football right now. So listen, if you want to cheer for Baker, celebrate Baker, I think that's totally fine. But I don't think it has to be this, like, one-for-one revisionist history of, like, man, the Browns, can you believe they moved on from this guy? They had him in their building, and look what he's doing now in Tampa Bay. Because, guys, at the time, it was a very different Baker Mayfield. It was a very different Cleveland Browns team. And the relationship, like I said, just had reached a point of no return. And so what's done is done. They had to sort of part ways, and that's where we're at. Like, does it suck that it turned out that way? Of course it does. Nobody wanted the Deshaun Watson experiment to fail the way that it has. But I'm telling you, like, it's not something that we should be just looking back on and saying, well, if they had only done this, things could have been differently. Maybe they could have. Yeah. But it's not that simple, because that lacks, when you just say that blanket statement of, like, they shouldn't have traded Baker Mayfield, they messed this up because of that. Like, they messed up the trade, yes, but it's not necessarily because they moved on from Baker Mayfield. I just think they made the wrong call on who they brought in. But at the same time, like, that lacks the context when you just put it out there as, like, a blanket statement of what was really going on behind the scenes within this organization. Speaking of things going on within this organization, Mike Vrabel's time with the Browns officially came to an end to start this week, as the Browns bid him farewell and he pursues whatever coaching vacancies are coming his way. What it means for potential other changes to the Browns coaching staff and front office, we'll talk about it next on the Locked On Browns podcast. So reports indicate that Mike Vrabel's time with the Cleveland Browns, his advisorship, if you will, ended officially on Monday. Is what his contract had sort of detailed when they brought him in. Now this is interesting from a number of levels because we know he's going to have NFL jobs. Being in Ohio, and you can probably see the Brutus Buckeye behind me. We know that Ohio State has been a team that everybody and their mother has linked him to and said, he should go back to college. He should be the next coach of Ohio State. And they have a big game on Wednesday that could dictate the future of their current head coach. And maybe that opens the door for Mike Vrabel to come there. I don't think it's going to happen because he's basically actively said he doesn't ever want to go back to college and coach. But you never know. Things, I guess money can talk and money can convince anybody of anything. But regardless, I'm less worried about what Mike Vrabel leaving and where he goes because that's a conversation for another time and probably another team to worry about because that'll be a massive addition for whatever team is any of these coach needy teams that are looking for somebody who's going to build a culture and bring some toughness to an organization. He is that guy, and so I understand why earlier in the season, when there was questions about Stefanski's future, why I was like, that's the natural progression, right? Like, let's just bring in Mike Vrabel and have him take the reins as the head coach. We now know it's not going to work that way because they are sticking with Stefanski. And, that's become very, very evident from Jimmy Haslam's comments in recent weeks. Barry, Stefanski are both safe. Now, what this means, though, in terms of the rest of the coaching staff is what I think is interesting. I can tell you from an observation standpoint, being at practice every day, one thing that struck me in recent weeks was the fact that, and maybe this has been like over a month now, I've noticed this, and it kind of came up like if you're watching the current Hard Knocks, the in-season Hard Knocks with the AFC North, there was an offensive line meeting where Roy Itzvin, the assistant offensive line coach, was running the meeting like in the film room. And people brought that up, and I know Stefanski was even asked about it, like, is that normal? And he basically downplayed and said, like, yeah, that happens. Like, the assistants sometimes run it, the main guys run it, whatever, in terms of like position coaches. But it wasn't Andy Dickerson, and that stood out to people. Well, I can tell you from like what we've seen at practice, there's been days where Andy Dickerson's just kind of like standing off to the side, talking with, players and kind of like teaching them some technique things, but that it's been Roy. And yeah, there was the report over the weekend from the NFL Network that Mike Vrabel's more so been running the offensive line stuff and sort of assumed a role there after he was working with the tight ends early in the season. And I have noticed his presence with the offensive line more, but it has been more so Roy Itzvin who has been sort of, doing like the actual drills where they're blocking each other and all these different things. So that was pretty telling as to like where things stand with certain coaches. Or at least one specific coach in Andy Dickerson. And listen, the offensive line regressed pretty badly this year. I think there's certainly reason to believe that Andy Dickerson's job is sort of on the line here. And at this time next week, we could be talking about a vacancy with the offensive line coach. And it's not going to be an easy room to fill ever because you're trying to replace Bill Callahan, who's maybe the best to ever do it. And obviously, Andy Dickerson doesn't seem like has been the fix or the sorbet to sort of smooth over the transition into a non-Bill Callahan-led unit. But yeah, like I think the fact that Mike Vrabel was stepping in more there, speaks to where this team is at with that position group specifically. And I think you can expect a change there. The trickle-down effect of that it remains to be seen. But I've already talked a little bit to you about other potential changes that could be looming. I'm at this point, I'm willing to sort of say I don't think Ken Dorsey is going to be back. I threw it out there weeks ago, but if he was brought in, the sole purpose was let's build an offense for Deshaun Watson. That's our main goal here. We want to complement him and put him in a position to be successful with his skill set. What are you accomplishing by bringing back Ken Dorsey next year with a chance to do what exactly? Like build an offense for a quarterback that fits more Stefanski's system? Because I just don't think it's going to happen. I think he's probably not long for the job here. I also brought up Bubba Ventrone, which pains me to say because I think Bubba's actually a hell of a coach, and I think that he is a good dude. But I just think special teams has been too inconsistent this year, and I honestly believe that the Browns are going to have to, address that and make some changes there. So I think the two of the top three assistants. I'm not worried about Jim Schwartz. I think Jim Schwartz is fine. I know people are calling for his job because the defense took a little bit of a step back, but the defense has been the least of their problems, I think, this year in the grand scheme of things. They've still been a pretty good unit. They're still like top 10 and on third downs. They're still pretty high up there in some other categories. So like they still do some things well. They still have some good players on that unit. They just were never going to live up to the expectation of the year before when they were a historically great defense in most games. I know they had the road struggles, but it was just not, it was going to be hard to replicate anything that they did last year. And I thought they were, good this year. Maybe not as good, but they were still good. So I don't think Jim Schwartz is in danger. But I those are kind of the big three that I'm looking at. And there could be others. There could be other assistant coaching positions that open up or that they move on from, just because they're running it back with the same guys at the top, the same brass who kind of oversees the day-to-day and leads the charge here with Stefanski and Barry. It doesn't mean that everybody is just coming back and is it's a clean slate for everyone. And you're just going to kind of like wipe it clean and start fresh and everyone gets a mulligan. I don't think that's going to be true for a number of position groups and their coaches. And obviously some of the higher end assistants, your offensive coordinator, your special teams coordinator. I think both those positions could be openings that the Browns are starting to field or look into this time next week, once week 18 is in the books and wrapped up completely. Another episode, speaking of being in the books, of the Locked On Browns podcast in the books. It's been a pleasure, Dog Pound. Thank you for joining me as always to talk about your favorite football team, even in what has been obviously a miserable 3-13 season to this point. But hey, we got months ahead to talk about the draft, and that should be an exciting thing because there's a lot of opportunities and potential that can come with that. So plenty more to talk about in the weeks and months ahead. I hope you continue to make us your first listen every day. For your second listen, go find a new Locked On NFL show, or if you want to keep it local, you can check out the Locked On Cavs podcast or the Locked On Guardians podcast. Thanks for being an everydayer at the Locked On Podcast Network. Talk to you again real soon, but for now, I'm out.